Good evening. This is the role of pulmonary surfactant. My name is Hannah Antosh, and this presentation is for Dr. Brittany Smith in Biology 520, Human Anatomy and Physiology 2. So to start off with, pulmonary surfactant is a mix of lipids and proteins, and this is actually quite a complex mix, as we can see by this. Oh no, my cute little chart here. Surfactant is broadly a mix of phospholipids, neutral lipids, and surfactant proteins. And surfactant is a broad term for surfactant. It's like anything that's going to repel something from the surface. So laundry detergents are considered to be surfactants. And these surfactants are going to be made in this alveolar space, which we'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide. So pulmonary surfactant is produced within the alveoli, which are these little raspberry looking guys right here. Each one of these little bubbles is kind of like an air sac, right? And these are found within the lungs. The pulmonary surfactant is produced in these, and then it is actually spread throughout the water molecules that are hiding within the lining of the alveoli. And surfactant is specifically secreted by type 2 alveolar cells. So surfactant has a couple major jobs, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the way they do those. So if you remember your 8th grade physical science class, or maybe even your freshman biology class, we learn that lipids do not like water. Not one singular bit. So when you're trying to, clean out a container of olive oil, right, you're going to see that the lipids and the water don't really mix. Now this is a special blend. So because water and lipids aren't really going to get along very well, those lipids and the surfactant, that surfactant itself, because it has low levels of cohesion, right, it doesn't have high levels of bonding, the surfactant actually decreases the amount of hydrogen bonding that the water molecules are able to do. And those low levels of cohesion lower the surface tension within the alveoli. And this lowering of the surface tension has two major benefits. The first one is that it eases the amount of effort that is needed to make the pulmonary system comply, right? It means it's going to take less effort to make the pulmonary system do what needs to be done because of this lowered surface tension. Secondly, it also reduces the lung's ability to recoil, which prevents lung collapse or a pneumothorax, which we're going to dive into in a lot more detail in a second. So alveoli provide a tremendous advantage because it increases the surface area. So think of like a sugar cube versus a single sugar molecule. The sugar cube actually has less surface area, even though it's larger, because the crystals dissolve one at a time. It will take longer for a sugar cube to dissolve than a single grain of sugar, because that single grain has more surface area available to the water. Whereas if it were in a sugar cube format, it would not, because most of it's in the cube. So same thing with alveoli, because they increase the amount of surface area, and that increased surface area allows for carbon dioxide and oxygen exchange as a part of respiration. However, alveoli can be quite unstable due to the intricate dance of the pressures, is what I'm going to call it, in order to keep the alveoli in correct positions. So smaller alveoli have a fairly nasty tendency to give their air to larger alveoli due to pressure changes. So think back to, again, could be freshman biology, when we learn about cellular cell movement, right? We learn about osmosis, we learn about concentration gradients, and how things like to move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So smaller alveoli are actually going to have more pressure than larger alveoli. And so what does pressure do? Well, pressure moves along its concentration gradient, right? So it's going to go from an area of high pressure, that small alveoli, to an area of low pressure, which is the larger alveoli. And that surfactant reduces the opportunities for the smaller alveoli to collapse because it reduces the surface tension. It reduces that surface tension in small alveoli more than it does in the surface tension of larger alveoli. That's because in smaller alveoli, those molecules are far more compact than they are in larger alveoli, right? So the larger the alveoli, the more spread out the molecules are. And the opposite is true. The smaller the alveoli, the smaller the the more compact the molecules are, because there's less space for those molecules to move around. Now, this can lead to a rather nasty disorder called newborn respiratory distress disorder. So in newborn respiratory distress syndrome, fetal lungs don't actually begin to create surfactant until end stages of pregnancy, when the baby is preparing for birth and preparing to breathe room air instead of relying on mom. So when babies are born too soon, they may not have sufficient levels of surfactant in order to prevent lung collapse. And in fact, fetal lungs are going to have to work significantly harder in order to breathe room air, because they are constantly fighting those pressure gradients. So when this happens, artificial surfactant is administered, and this can be done in a liquid form through an endotracheal tube. This can be done through intubation, surfactant administration, extubation. So in this particular procedure, an infant is intubated, surfactant is administered, and then the infant is extubated. We also have the MIST method, and MIST method is going to require a CPAP support, but again, artificial surfactant will be administered. Now, I talked a little bit earlier about pneumothorax. So pneumothorax is a collapsed lung, which is what surfactant is supposed to help combat. However, there are times when surfactant is unable to prevent a collapsed lung. And this can include, so a pneumothorax specifically is when air begins to occupy the space between your chest wall and the pleural space. And there are several different types of pneumothorax. So the first one is spontaneous. And we have a primary spontaneous pneumothorax and a secondary spontaneous pneumothorax. So a spontaneous pneumothorax is a pneumothorax that comes out of nowhere. It just happens. An injury didn't cause it. They just happen. So a primary spontaneous pneumothorax happens with no underlying health conditions or diseases. And this can actually occur when abnormal air pockets called blebs break and release air into that chest cavity, or in between the chest wall and the pleural space. Secondary spontaneous pneumothoraxes can happen after a lung disease. So a bulle that bursts can cause a secondary spontaneous pneumothorax. We also have traumatic pneumothoraxes. And this can either be injury related or it can be iatrogenic. So an injury-related pneumothorax could be from a stab wound that punctures that pleural space. It can happen when a rib is fractured and punctures. Any injury can cause that, or injuries that can cause that. We also have iatrogenic pneumothoraxes, and those are pneumothoraxes that occur during a medical procedure. So placing a chest tube, or inserting a central line can cause a pneumothorax. There is also something called a tension pneumothorax, and this happens when air is unable to escape, and this is an emergency that requires immediate treatment. There's also something called a catamenial pneumothorax, and this is probably the most interesting of them. A catamenial pneumothorax is caused when a woman has endometriosis. Now, endometriosis is a condition that's caused, and I'm speaking from knowledge. Sorry, I forgot to get you a citation. But it's from knowledge, unfortunately. But endometriosis is a condition in which the woman's endometrium is no longer contained to her uterus where it should be. In fact, endometrium is growing outside of the uterus throughout all of the organs. And what can happen in a catamenial pneumothorax is that endometriosis, that tissue that should be contained within the uterus, actually spreads throughout the body, and can cause bleeding in that chest wall and into that pleural space. Now, there are several treatments for pneumothoraxis. The first one is observation. This is typically going to be a go-to when pneumothoraxis are very mild, and you just check in with your doctor. Oxygen therapy is another treatment. Thoracentesis is a great treatment. This happens when a needle is inserted between the ribs, on whichever side the pneumothorax is located. Chest tubes are also a common procedure for this. This is when a tube is inserted to drain the air, to allow the lungs to heal, and that chest tube can be in place for several days. And finally, we have a chemical pleurodesis. And this is when an incision is made, a tube is placed, and then a chemical is actually used to reattach the lungs to the chest cavity. Thank you so much.